Displaced, by S.R. Woodward. Chapter 1. I was an ordinary soul in our village, just a young 20-something farm worker trying to make my way in life. The village I called my own was Treleaven. It was small and just a rural farming community in the southwest of England. But we did have our grocery store, and we did have our petrol station. In essence though, that was it. The Cornish town of Treleaven wasn't on the coast and it wasn't next to any of the moors, and I suppose this was why we were uninterrupted by holidaymakers and truly uninterrupted by the rest of the world. It was a good place to live. After my father died, I was willed the cottage I now live in, attached to Farmer Pengowan's land a few miles away from the village centre. It was quiet and serene, if you could call nature quiet, but that's the way it felt. There's something peaceful about nature's natural cacophony. Fortunately for me, Mr. Pengowan believed in perpetuating the right of the workers, and although I didn't work for him often, my father had, and that was enough. I was allowed to call Pengowan's cottage my home. When the sun came up, I got up also, whether it be 4 a.m. in the morning during the summer or 7 a.m. during the winter. I followed the sun. This was the way, very rural, but nothing could beat it. On occasions Pengowan asked me to perform the odd task, herding the sheep or using the huge combine to harvest his crops. It didn't matter to me what he asked. I was pleased to be a part of Earth's natural cycle. Sowing, seeding, and reaping. I enjoyed this life. After finishing my chores, I would collapse in my bed which overlooked the fields, exhausted and happy, fulfilled. And this was how I had continued for the 36 months, 3 seasonal cycles, since my father's death, until today. This morning I had awoken feeling groggy, as if sleep had eluded me for most of the previous night, and as I sat on the edge of my bed trying to shake an unusual consuming tiredness from my mind, I recalled strange dreams of dazzling brightness, images of cornfields somehow below me, ones that were moving away becoming smaller until they seemed nothing more than scale models. For a short while I struggled to grasp the dream memories, trying to get hold of them, trying to visualize them in the clarity they'd had, but as I did, they slipped away, becoming more elusive as my tiredness receded. Eventually they were nothing more than wisps of a memory I was no longer interested in, and I got up as my thoughts turned to my usual routine. Every few days, I visited the village store, purchasing the bread, milk and eggs Pengowan's farm didn't produce. I was okay for meat, particularly lamb, and sausages were available, intermittently. But this day, Mrs. Cottrell, the owner of the store, ignored me. Ignored me is too strong. She didn't recognize me as a regular. She didn't recognize me at all. She also seemed a little afraid by my presence in her shop. But Mrs. Cottrell, I implored, I'm Joseph. You know, Joseph Meviers, from up the lane. And as I indicated my road, pointing in its direction, she stepped back from her side of the counter before answering.
So you say. But you are not the Joseph Meviers, I know.
Though she was robust in her reply, I could tell by her stance fear had taken hold.
You are not entitled to any discounts.
She continued.
Now pay me what you owe and get out. Go away and don't come back. I know what you are. Changeling.
Though confused and having no clue as to what she was talking about, I didn't want to upset her any further, so I purchased the food I could afford at the going price and left. I certainly didn't want to upset the owner of the village shop any more than I had done. But the situation was strange, and I could not figure out why she'd decided not to know me anymore, apart from that peculiar word she'd used, changeling. I shook my head, nothing clear becoming apparent. I knew she was getting on a bit and dearly hoped that this wasn't the onset of one of those degenerative mental illnesses. She was too nice to have that happen to her. I left the village center and made my way back to my cottage, trying to reconcile what had just happened with the woman I knew her to be from past experience. Just as I was approaching my front door, I was distracted from my thoughts as Farmer Pengowan stepped out in front of me, blocking my way.
Joseph,
he said.
I need to know what you have been doing.
Nothing, I answered immediately in my defense. Then, considering what had been said, I asked, what do you mean?
What have you done to my crop?
He said. I had no idea of what he was talking about. I was just making my way back from the village to my cottage.
At least 70% of the corn has been irrecoverably damaged.
He told me.
You look after it. What have you done?
Nothing, sir, honestly, I said. I haven't even started to harvest it.
Are you responsible for the field?
Pengowan asked me. Of course I am, I said.
Then how do you explain the state it is in now?
I don't know, I said. What's wrong with it?
Have a look for yourself.
He told me. He let me go past him so I could dump my shopping in the house. Once I'd put the carrier bags on my kitchen table, I stepped back outside my cottage, and he spoke to me again.
Well?
He said, "Sorry, sir, I still don't understand what you're talking about," I said, shaking my head.
Come with me.
He instructed. I followed him around the back of the cottage and along the path towards the fields. He waved his arm across the vista, and I looked. I couldn't see anything of a worry, but then he pointed it out.
See?
He said. What I saw was a field of corn that had somehow been flattened, in places. My first thought was that there had been a localized storm, some wind or something, perhaps even some heavy rain. But seeing how the corn had been flattened, I began to wonder. There were twirls and circles, lines and more circles, spirals, all interconnected, a very strange pattern. And I began to feel Mr. Pengowan was blaming me for the damage. I didn't do this, I told him. But he just looked at me. I didn't ruin the crop, honestly, sir, I affirmed. Pengowan, and his family, had known my family for a long, long time, and I think he believed me because of this, though his demeanor glinted with an edge of doubt, but if he didn't, then the reasons were beyond me. Saying no more, he turned for his Land Rover, got in it and left me, driving up the unmade road which led from the cottage to the farmhouse, some half-mile up the hill. I looked at the crop again, and the damage, now that it had been pointed out to me from this vantage point, was obvious. Between the remaining upright sandy yellow corn stalks that were rocking gently in the slight breeze, around the edges of the field, I could see that the center of the field had been pressed down, to the earth, in some way. There'd be no harvesting of this field in a few weeks, I knew. If anything, it would need plowing straight back into the ground. What a waste of a season. I left my vantage point next to the low leafy green hedgerow at the rear of my cottage and made my way back, entering the kitchen and putting the kettle on. Whilst the water was trying to get up to the boil on my gas cylinder-driven stove, I climbed the short stairway to my bedroom beneath the cottage's thatched roof, to look out of the window over the field. I was stunned when I saw the full extent of the geometric designs that had been imprinted on Farmer Pengowan's field, and although I'd heard of such things, I'd never seen it, but for sure, this was one of those crop circles you read about in the newspapers from time to time. I began to wonder about who could have done this, who in our village would have such a malicious but artistic bent. None of the families I knew would. Perhaps it was the out-of-towners, attempting a laugh at our expense. At least none of the fields further away from the cottage had been damaged as far as I could tell from my window. The kettle began to whistle, summoning me, and I left the view to go back down the stairs to the kitchenette to make my tea. As I sat there on my chair at the plain wood table in the middle of the kitchen's dusty grey slate floor, I racked my brains, trying to think of anyone who may have something against Mr. Pengowan or me, but no one would come to mind. I decided the destruction of the crop was down to a misguided practical joke by some townies. As I had an early start the next day, I quickly washed up the crockery and cutlery and turned in for the night. Morning broke and I woke up. I didn't need an alarm clock as my bedroom window was without curtains, and the early morning light always roused me from my sleep, and if not the light, then nature always had a way. Gingerly I got out of bed. My body felt as if I had been stacking straw bales for 4 hours straight. But I hadn't. That onerous task was to come in the next few weeks. And again, I felt as if my sleep had been poisoned by strange dreams of dazzling lights, and the view of fields below me. But even these memories had been tainted further, by images of sleek glistening, black-walled triangular rooms, illuminated by purplish UV light, and images of gangly human-esque surgeons. All my muscles ached, and my head throbbed terribly. Each way I turned to look, it felt as if my sinuses were filled with fluid. And in my ears I could hear the sounds of light kindling, crackling, as if in a fire. I hoped I wasn't coming down with a summer flu, but if I was, it would explain the fevered dreams. Standing up on my feeble legs, I got dressed and made my way downstairs for breakfast, though I didn't feel like eating. Ultimately, I opted for a cup of tea and nothing else. After putting the kettle on, I opened the fridge and poured some milk into my cup. The milk trickled out of the bottle sludge like it was off. Just to make sure, I sniffed at it and recoiled, smelling the wet sour smell that indicated it was no good anymore. I'd only bought it yesterday, so I checked the fridge hadn't turned itself off during the night by looking for the frost that always built up in the freezer compartment. It was still there. The milk had not been exposed to a warm summer night, and there was no icy caking along the bottom of the freezer box. I made myself another cup and took my tea neat, swilling down a couple of paracetamol along with it. Knowing the chores I had to complete for this morning, I checked the clock to see how long I could rest before getting on with them. I hoped there would be enough time to allow the pills to work, but there wasn't. I rubbed my eyes to make sure they were free from sleep, and it wasn't affecting my vision, but it didn't help. The clock said 8 a.m. Somehow, I'd slept through the sunrise at 5:30, and although the quality of light coming through my kitchen window told me it must be later, I still reached for my wristwatch I always left in the fruit bowl on the sideboard before going to bed. Looking at it, it told me the same thing. It was 8 a.m. Now I knew I wasn't well at all, and for the first time since I'd started working for Mr. Pengowan, I picked up the phone to call him, to let him know it was not possible for me to work today. Dialing his number, I waited for the connection to click through and for him to answer, but after the numbers had stopped clicking, all I got was a single pitched tone telling me I'd either rung the wrong number or he'd been disconnected. I tried again, dialing the numbers for his farmhouse, more slowly this time, but the result was the same. As the painkillers began to ease my bodily aches, I decided to go to the village to get some more milk and replace the pint that had gone off. I picked up my moss green jacket from the back of my battered sofa and putting it on I left the cottage, then stopped abruptly after shutting the front door behind me. I stared at the path which led to my front door. The path I regularly cleared of weeds at least once a week, normally twice, but the path I now saw had at least 3 weeks' growth on it, I assumed, if not more. If I was going to do anything today, I would clear the path, but first I would get some more milk. I began to walk the 2 miles into the village down the single-track road which led up to my cottage. It was lined by hedgerow on either side, interspersed by the occasional tree, and had, in places, the odd tuft of grass poking through the road's surface along its centerline. As I made my way, I started to notice inconsistencies in my next day's life, all of which were pointing to a wholly different season from the one I went to bed in. I noticed red holly berries that were beginning to show themselves in the hedgerow. The leaves on some of the trees that lined the lane had started to turn autumn's orange golden brown. The acorns from the oaks which grew at random intervals on either side of the road were scattered across its uncared for tarmac. If I was perceiving all these signals correctly, then without a doubt, it was autumn, but I knew for a certainty I had gone to bed in late August, the summer. Knowing I was unwell, I decided to put these thoughts to the back of my mind. I would get my milk and then I would tackle my path. At the end of the lane was the village petrol station, and arriving here always told me that I was only a few more minutes away from the grocery store. I nearly walked past the garage without a second's thought, but as I got to the furthest end of its forecourt something triggered in my head and I stopped. I turned to look at it. There was a rusty iron chain across its entrance and exit. There were no lights illuminating the inside of the little shop that was a part of it, and there was a sign which stated it was closed. In my entire life this petrol station had never been closed during the day, especially at this time of the morning, but today it obviously was. I wondered where the owners were. I was certain that Mrs. Cottrell would know what was going on. So, I stepped up my pace and made my way to the shop, as quickly as I could manage with my aching limbs. Even if she still didn't know me, she would definitely know what was going on. She was the village's information center. Though this was not an official title or anything, it was just the way the village worked. Mobile phones were next to useless as the operators had not considered getting a decent signal in Treleaven a priority, and those of us who did need mobile communications stuck with the trusty walkie-talkie, and this was the way we liked it. Walking past the small concrete-based, tubular open sign on the little bit of pavement that existed in the village, I pushed open the olive green framed door to the store and entered, the brass bell above it announcing another customer's interest. The interior had changed somewhat since my visit the day before, and it took a few moments more than usual before I found the open-faced fridge containing the plastic milk cartons. I picked one up, a 2-pinter this time. As I didn't need anything else, I walked around the new shelving which filled the center of the shop to find the checkout, and finding it I waited to be served. There was no bell to push on the counter that I could ring any longer. It seemed that this style of service was no more. So, I coughed. Eventually a woman in her early 40s, I must guess, wearing a dowdy brown knitted cardigan walked up to the counter from the back room, which was still separated from the shop by multicolored vertical strips of 1970s plastic. I didn't recognize her at all. Seeing the milk carton I had in my hand, she asked me,
"Will that be all?"
I told her yes, and she rang up the cost on the till.
"That'll be £1.15.
She said. Before handing my money over to her, I was determined to find out where Mrs. Cottrell was, so I asked, "Where's Mrs. Cottrell today?" I got a blunt reply.
"She died 2 weeks ago,"
was the answer, and although I thought that would be it, she continued,
"I haven't seen you in here before. Did you know her?"
Of course, I knew her. She served me, I nearly said, yesterday, but quickly changed my tack, only the other week, and I live just up the lane, here. I indicated the direction I had come from. Was it dementia? I asked.
No.
The woman in the shop started.
"My aunt was sound as a bell. It was a heart attack. Though if you believe what some are saying in the village, she'd been scared to death."
I just blinked at this answer, and then Mrs. Cottrell's niece continued.
"Have you heard that Farmer Pengowan has disappeared?"
All I could do was shake my head. My mind was in turmoil. Surely only yesterday I'd had a minor confrontation with Mrs. Cottrell. And Pengowan, that was another question. Suffice it to say, I handed over the money and left the store. I now felt very confused. All my timelines were off somehow. I wandered back home trying to figure out what was happening. As I walked up the lane, I saw a gray squirrel grasping at one of the acorns on the road, putting it in its mouth. When it spotted me, it leapt into action, keeping the acorn in its mouth as it dived through the hedgerow to wherever it needed to go. Sitting at the table in my cottage, I glanced at the clock. It told me that it was only midday. And as I waited for the kettle to boil, I looked around my kitchen, not knowing what else to do, noticing the heavy cobwebs that had appeared in its corners. I rubbed my head round and round with my hand, trying to get a handle on the situation I found myself in, but it didn't help. The only conclusion I could draw was that I'd lost some time out of my life, somehow. And before I could think further about it, the kettle boiled, whistling, so I picked it up and made my tea. Pouring the warm, refreshing liquid down my throat, my thoughts turned to the chores Farmer Pengowan expected me to complete. Barring the field that had been flattened, there were 3 others to harvest, but I couldn't do this today. I needed some rest. Tomorrow would be the day, I decided. But the thought that I was not like this, or I shouldn't be, instilled a sense of guilt I wasn't used to feeling. As I supped my tea, I knew today was not the day I should climb into the great yellow and blue combine to start my task. Tomorrow, I would do it tomorrow. And that was fact. And that was my decision. As I sat at my table looking out of the back window of the kitchen, over the hedgerow and into the unharvested fields that lay beyond, I rested within myself, just being, with no thoughts as to doing. Gradually the sun continued its path from the daytime sky and started its descent towards the horizon. All the while I watched the colors the sunset generated as its light made changes to the contrast and brightness that had accentuated the life force the crops seemed to emanate, and not moving from my seat in the kitchen, I sat there watching, somehow being a part of the cycle. And as I did this, I attempted to put all the things I now knew into some kind of logical form, some neat little scenario that would explain everything I'd experienced so far. Darkness enveloped the outside, with the hedgerows disappearing into blackness after the beige cornfields. I got up from my table. It was time to go back to bed and rest, getting ready for the coming morn and the tasks I would have to complete as a part-time employee of Farmer Pengowan. though I wasn't sure I needed to anymore, if he had truly disappeared. But I had been charged with these duties, and just because he wasn't here at the moment, it didn't really mean I was discharged from them. Chapter 2. I awoke in my bed suddenly, thrown from another traumatic nightmare, fleeting glimpses of a chilled, dark room which now included 2 real visions of a 3-pronged instrument sizzling as it pushed through my abdomen. I leant over the side of the bed and dry heaved, no contents to expel. As I sat back up, I began to feel a little better, the retching seeming to purge my illness slightly, and as I recovered, whatever had woken me was gone and it was morning again. My body still ached, but as I looked through my bedroom window, the pains I was suffering disappeared into the back of my mind. I now looked out over fields hidden beneath a severe blanket of white. The hedgerows and fences that separated them were now walls of white, something. As I breathed out, I noticed a cloudy vapor and then the penny dropped. I was looking at snow, but snow in August. Easing myself out of my bed, into the bedroom, the cold hit me with a force I was not used to at this time of year. I got dressed as fast as I could and made my way down the wooden stairs to my kitchenette. I had to get the heating on. This was my first concern before I could try and tackle, mentally, the unseasonal weather. Within a few moments I had the fire burning in the hearth, and although I'd achieved this fairly quickly, I knew it would be a good 40 minutes before it began dishing out the required heat to the rest of the cottage. Wrapping my dark blue cotton dressing gown around me over my clothes, I sat in front of the fire waiting for it to do its work, wondering why I should have had to take such actions. Perhaps this was just one of the problems supposed climate change wrought. As the heat permeated the cottage, I took off my dressing gown and threw it over the back of my sofa. Very soon I could have a shower, the water in the back boiler being hot enough to do so. In the meantime, I made myself a hot drink, tea seeming the simplest option. I didn't bother with milk this time as I desperately needed to warm up, and as I poured the boiling water onto the tea bag, I began to feel like this drink was all I was living on. But as they say, starve a fever, feed a cold. As I supped my drink, the wood in the fireplace began to burn low, and it was apparent that I ought to top it up if it was going to continue to heat my home. Putting on some Wellington boots and a jacket, I left the comfortable heat of the kitchen-cum-living area and crunched through the snow in my small back garden, to the shed that housed more fuel for the fire. After clearing the snow from the shed's entrance, I pulled its rickety door open and began removing the logs I would use, placing them on the roped flat piece of hardboard I had for these occasions. Almost full, I picked up 3 more logs, continuing my automaton style of stacking I'd developed over the years from tasks such as this, my mind focusing on heaving the load back up the garden to the kitchen. Turning, I pulled the hardboard sled away from the shed's door so that I could close it easily, then turning back I placed my hand on the edge of the door, about 3/4 of the way up, ready to close it, and as I did so, I glanced at the depleted pile. The sight I saw made me collapse onto the makeshift sled, heavily. 2 boots, ones you could call farmer's boots, were poking out from the bottom of the stack. I blinked my eyes and shook my head in an attempt, I suppose, to clear what I was seeing from my vision. Within seconds my consciousness began to register the odor of death, but not the usual smell of an abattoir that housed dead pigs or sheep. There was a very subtle difference, a difference I instantly recognized because I could see the boots. I had to find out who it was, though my mind was already telling me. As fast as I could, I worked through the remainder of the pile, chucking each log to the other side of the shed. One by one the removed logs began to uncover shins, knees and waist, all still clothed, but after that the torso was bare. But not just bare, it was mutilated. The internal organs, those that still existed, were there to see, exposed as nature hadn't intended them to be, their covering missing. I'd done a fair bit of butchery as part of my chores for Farmer Pengowan and saw immediately that the liver and heart were gone, though the strangest thing of all was the lack of any blood. It was almost as if this body had been prepared in some way, perhaps even for exhibition. I didn't pause for long contemplating this. I had to know who it was, for definite. I cleared the last of the logs away, then froze. The dull open eyes which stared at me belonged to my father's friend and employer. It was Farmer Pengowan. My empty stomach retched. It was only the uncontrollable shivering that brought me round. I'd passed out and fallen into the snow that had enveloped my garden. With as much control as I could muster, I pulled the loaded sled back towards the cottage, not looking back, not wanting to acknowledge that which existed in my shed. Eventually I pulled the back door closed. The logs were now stacked up, appropriately, next to the fire, and although the cottage was warm and cozy, I still shivered, deeply, as if my very soul had been chilled to temperatures that only existed in the minds of scientists. In an attempt to rid myself of these shakes, I picked up my kettle and held it, clattering, against the silver nozzle of the tap in my kitchen. As it rattled, so it filled, very slowly, my shivering making the waters flow a hit or miss affair, but I did it, and once completed I placed the kettle on the stove, after which I fell back into my sofa to wait, still riven by the shakes. The kettle began its whistle, and unsteadily I got up, reaching for the cupboard, taking a single tea bag from the steel container marked tea. After pouring the hot water onto the tea bag, I opened my fridge to get the milk, reaching for it. I didn't pick it up. This time I knew it was off. The fur on its surface, a very light avocado in color, spoke volumes. I poured the hot water into my mug and sat down again, ready for yet another cup of neat tea. I now knew that it wasn't August anymore, no more than yesterday had been late August. Somehow my life had been skipping weeks at a time, and during these periods I had slept. But I felt this couldn't be right. The times I'd awoken full of aches and pains surely meant that during my unconscious moments I'd been doing something. As these thoughts went through my mind, I finished my tea, and putting the mug down I made my way to the shower, thinking that perhaps this action would afford me some clarity on the situation I now found myself in. Stripping off in the bathroom, I turned towards the shower, reaching in and turning the taps to the positions I knew, from experience, would deliver a comfortable stream. I then turned to face the full-length mirror. At first what I saw I believed to be an artifact of the steam that coated it, but as I rubbed it down with a towel, the illness I had been suffering showed itself in its entirety. I was looking at an exhausted man whose pallor was that of a person tinged a light grey-green, one who had 3 open and weeping suppurate welts, 2 just below each rib cage and 1 where the belly button should have been, each as raw as they looked. Logic told me that these wounds on my torso should be extremely painful, should be hurting, but there was no sensation at all, no irritation and no feeling. It was almost as if the damage to my body had been anesthetized in some manner. I looked at my eyes, as I now felt that all parts of me ought to go through an examination of sorts, and saw desperation, encapsulated by heavy brows and dark rings. I closed them to this vision and rubbed the mirror once more, hoping beyond hope that all I was seeing was part of some fevered hallucination. But as I slowly opened my eyes and saw my hand, I stopped. What was before me, holding the towel against the mirror, wasn't my hand, and although I had accepted, sort of, the color of my skin, the webs between my fingers were plain to see. I dropped the towel and checked my other hand. It was the same. Whatever I was suffering was more than just a summer flu, but what it was I couldn't fathom. One thing was for sure though, I was changing, metamorphosing in some way. I was becoming not me anymore, physically at least. I turned the shower off, knowing in my heart it wouldn't help. Chapter 3. Everything I'd seen and acknowledged so far was a trauma, but one part of me, deep down, was exerting normality. A way to survive this experience, I guess. And in this vein, I decided to go back to the village to pick up milk, once more. This was the way I would survive what I was going through. Perhaps long life was what I should choose this time, my mind told me, but not on foot. Don't be silly, the snow had put paid to that. Of course, it had. It would be easier to use my mountain bike as I had done in previous years when the snow had fallen. The bike would cut through the snow quite simply. I would go to the village and stock up on the milk and any other food he required. My bike was kept in the outhouse, a flimsily built attachment to the cottage. Well, it looked flimsy to me, but it had been there as long as I could remember. Normally I would enter the outhouse from the rear of the cottage, but not wanting to ever clap eyes on the shed ever again, I went out of the front door, traipsed across the snow-covered overgrown path and opened the front of the wooden building, entering. I saw my bike leaning against the old wooden walls, its tires deflated through lack of use and care, but this was the norm. I only ever used it when walking was going to be too slow, and strangely, when it snowed, cycling on a mountain bike was a lot easier than walking. Knowing where the pump was, I pulled the canvas covering from the top of the oil and muck-stained bench to retrieve it, dumping the canvas on the floor. Reaching for the pump, I nearly picked it up, but impossibly gleaming silver tools stopped me, and I looked at him, and for some reason a smile that felt knowing graced my face. These tools, ones I'd never seen before, were lying on the bench calling to be held. They were vaguely similar to a butcher's kit but more perfect in some way. And as I looked at him, I noticed a few were discolored. I leant closer to get a better look, sniffing the air, then moved away quickly. Two of them, the ones with unrealistically thin silvery blades, had been tainted by hardened reddy brown glutinous lumps which had formed almost perfect spherical droplets on their surfaces. None of the other tools were discolored in this way, and none of the other silvery tools looked like anything from any person's toolbox that he knew. Just the view of these tools made me wonder whether Farmer Pengowan's body had been carved up here, in the outhouse, and that thought was promptly followed by the question of who had done it. You. I heard a distant voice call out in my mind but dismissed it as a bizarre ethereal insight that had been induced by the fever I was suffering. Feeling my bile rise, I retreated back to my kitchen, the urge to gather any food today being completely usurped. I made myself another neat tea, and as I drank it, I looked out of the kitchen window at my small garden and the white fields beyond, without passion and without being. I was completely drained of everything that made me, me. The light began to dwindle and automatically I made my way to bed, rubbing my hands together knowingly, a small part of me wishing that when I awoke everything that had gone on would disappear as if part of some cruel and vicious nightmare. Without any energy I collapsed into bed fully clothed, and for a second time a smile crossed my face. I hadn't the wherewithal to change for bed, and I hadn't the wherewithal to be bothered about it. Chapter 4. My eyes flickered open in response to the sun hitting them. I think it was the sun, but I couldn't move. The ache that he'd felt in the passing days had gone, only to be replaced by nothingness in his limbs. As my consciousness rose, I felt a tightness on my chest. It was like the shirt he wore had become tighter in some way, smaller by a fraction, but I couldn't lift his arms to assuage the feeling. I tried to exclaim, "What the hell?" But my voice was just a mere whisper of its former self, my throat being terribly dry. I wondered where I was, but looking to my left, I saw the windows without curtains and knew I was in his father's house, lying in his bed, and all was calm. Not resisting the paralysis, I lay there looking out of the window at this planet's natural day. Then suddenly my serenity was shattered. The noise sounded like the door to his cottage was being smashed in, rending cracks filling the air. The sirens piercing this new day assailed my ears. I wanted to get up to see what was happening, but every time I tried, nothing moved. My transformation was not yet complete. Then his bedroom door swung back against the room's wall, banging loudly, and people in blue clothing jumped on us, turning us over, handcuffing his hands behind my back. I tried to ask what was going on, but I only exhaled, no sounds coming forth from my mouth. As they lifted me onto a stretcher and carted us down his wooden stairs, prone, I heard him screaming inaudibly in my head, "What have I done? What have I done?" And then we were in their vehicle and traveling, going to who knows where. As I tried to struggle, only by turning his head violently, no other part of his body able to move, the image of a blurred man crossed my vision as he leant over me, placing a transparent mask on my mouth, holding it firm. The man turned to someone behind him, talking, and although the words he said, I knew I ought to know, their meaning was lost on me, an alien language to my ears. I heard a hissing sound, and a distantly familiar, almost sweet smell filled my nose, and with each breath I took, so light changed into darkness.